For the next hour, you'll be leaving the show me state and entering the show me the money state. So stop what you're doing, grab a pen, and get ready to learn. Jake Floyd of Floyd Financial Group will be your guide for straight talk and honest answers about living the life you deserve in retirement. So prepare to be empowered. Now, here are your Show Me the Money hosts, Jake Floyd and Jeff Shade.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Welcome to Show Me the Money, the radio show that gives you the straight talk and honest answers you need to help you reach your wealth management and retirement goals through smart investing and careful planning. On today's show, we're going to be talking about current events, the earnings season coming up, also mistakes that people make with a 401k, the realities of spousal risk in retirement, and finally, 5 retirement planning myths that could hold you back. My name's Jeff Shade, and as always, I'm just here to ask the questions. But the words of wisdom and solid advice, they come from Jake Floyd of Floyd Financial Group. Hey, Jake, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. Thank you for asking.
Certainly welcome, my friend. Hope everybody else having a great Saturday. We appreciate you joining us each and every Saturday morning. April is here already. Hard to believe it. April showers bring May flowers. They also bring the weeds. I'm watching them grow about an inch overnight here out in my front yard. That's just what happens. But anyway, we'll get through all of this. Let's talk about what's going on in current events right now. I'm going to talk a little bit about earnings season, Jake, because it's coming up very, very shortly. First of all, for those people who do not know what earnings season is and why it's important, can you explain that to us a little bit?
Sure. So in general, I'm going to go pretty basic here. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page here. So during earnings season, companies report their revenue, how much business they do, and how much profit they make. The level of the stock market and the price of a stock in general is largely determined by those two factors, how much business they're doing and how much profit they're making. Are they growing? Are they doing more revenue and profit? Are they doing less revenue and profit? And so those are big metrics that come in, and they have to report if they're publicly traded on the NYSE or the NASDAQ. They have to report once every quarter. Before the earnings report, a lot of analysts come out and say, hey, I think this company is going to do this much business and this much profit. And so when you hear on the news, they say, hey, this company beat their earnings or beat on revenue, what they mean is they did better than expected on revenue, did better than expected on earnings. Honestly, in today's world, how much business they do or how much profit they make this time is not going to matter nearly as much as what they guide that they're going to do in the future, meaning they give these numbers on what they've done, and then they say for the next quarter and the next year, we think we're going to do this much business and this much profit. So in this world, in this time with tariffs and all this kind of thing, they're likely to sandbag those numbers, in my opinion, meaning they're going to say, hey, I don't want to set too high an expectation so I can't meet it. So what I'm going to do is take what I think I'm going to do and then minus 10% or something and say, hey, due to these tariffs at certain times, we think we're going to do less business. So if that happens, the market's not going to like that very much. So I have a lot of people asking me if we're kind of out of the woods yet. I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet. However, once all these companies come through and they give conservative guidance or sandbag their guidance and they say, hey, we don't think we're going to do a whole bunch next year, what's going to happen almost invariably is 3 months later, they're going to do another earnings season and they're going to smash all those numbers into oblivion. And then everybody's going to realize how cheap stocks are and we're going to be off to the races. So I do think the bottom of this little run here is coming, but I'm not sure that it's in just yet. And earnings season officially kind of kicks off on the 11th and then all through the week of the 14th. And then the tech earnings are the following week. That's probably 70-80% of the earnings over that 2.5 weeks. So I think that's going to be really, really important. And it's something we're going to be kind of glued to, making sure we understand what's going on.
Jake, you mentioned tariffs there. Because of the tariffs and what's going on right now, could this first earnings season report be not necessarily a good indicator of what future earnings would be later on in the year once things settle down a little bit?
I think there's going to be a lot of companies that do pretty good on earnings, meaning their actual report is good, but then they're going to guide lower. And again, the stock is really more concerned with what's happening coming up than what's happening in the past. It does matter, but it's much more important if they start saying, hey, we did $1 million in business, for example, this quarter, but we think we're only going to do 800,000 next quarter, right? That's a dying business, and there's going to be some panic around that if that happens. So that being said, that's not a guarantee, but that's personally what I think is going to happen. And so we're not ready to jump all in just yet, although there are a lot of companies that are very attractive at the current prices. I think we may get a little bit better buying opportunities. So as a lot of people are listening to this and they're wondering kind of what's coming, There are pockets of exuberance out there. If you saw the Newsmax IPO last week, it IPO'd at like $14, went to $147 the next morning. That company, by the way, is insanely overvalued. So I would not recommend jumping in on that unless you're just kind of a gambler by nature, because that's kind of what you're doing at this point. That company is trading in the stratosphere, not from a stock price standpoint, but from a price to how much business they're doing and how much they're earning. Just to give you an example, Jeff, they were at like $13 billion is what they said the company was worth, and it's making $5 million a year in profit. So that would be like if you had a business here in town and you're doing $100,000 a year in business, it would be like putting a $300 million price tag on that business. Maybe that divided by 100, you might be kind of close on open markets, but even in a local business, you're still too high. You need to divide it by 500 or 600 before you're actually in the ballpark. So it's at such a stratospheric level. That doesn't mean it can't go higher. Alan Greenspan, the old Federal Reserve chair back in the 90s, said that markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. And so that doesn't mean it's necessarily coming down right away, but over the long haul, we're going to see that thing plummet big time just simply because they can't do enough business to justify that valuation. So there's plenty of exuberance out there in certain pockets, and people are ready for some good news. I just think we need to not jump the gun quite yet. We need to wait for confirmation in earnings season.
Talking to Jake Floyd of Floyd Financial Group on Show Me the Money here on 104.1 FM KSGF. We're on every Saturday morning for you. And again, if you have questions about anything that we talked about today, you want to get in and sit down with Jake, talk about earnings season, talk about your equity portfolio, 417-889-7233 is our telephone number. That is the number that you'll call right now if you'd like. Leave your name, telephone number. Ashley will call you back during the week. And what's going to happen there is she'll set you up with an appointment to talk with Jake about your individual situation. Doesn't have to be about corporate earnings season or equities. It can be about anything that has to do with your journey towards a confident retirement. No cost, no obligation for this. Certainly there is no judgment ever. 417-889-7233. And of course, our website, FloydFinancialGroup.com. Jake, you were talking about buying opportunities. If earnings season is not as good as we'd hoped for, would this present a buying opportunity?
That's a little bit too general, Jeff, but I would say this, very possibly that could be the case. And so the reason I say that is there's a lot of other factors to consider. So if the actual reporting of earnings is poor, then we have to start questioning if we're going to have some kind of a recession here, because if already the earnings are coming down, and this would be for the first quarter, before really any of the tariffs even went into effect, then we have to question whether after the tariffs are in, if it's possible for us to kind of correct that in short order. So I would say that if the guidance comes down, that's one thing, and I'm confident that companies are doing better than a lot of people think. But if we are to see the numbers actually come down, we still have the Federal Reserve kind of behind us ready to cut rates, and they have a lot of ammunition if they really need it. So if it comes around and earnings are not so good and jobs start to dry up, the Federal Reserve will not hesitate to start cutting rates. They could cut 17 quarters of 1% before they get to zero, and that's before they start with the QE and all that kind of thing. So I think the Fed will throw the kitchen sink at this thing if it needs to prop it up, but I'm not sure that they will even need to. I think that it's likely that we get through this. I think the tariffs are somewhat transitory in nature, to use an old word that a lot of people don't like, that the Fed used to use, but I think that tariffs are going to kind of come and go. We're going to put tariffs on, and a lot of them are going to come off in fairly short order. Again, I don't know that for sure, but that's my best guess. And then when we get to next earnings season, we're going to see these numbers are much better than they were expecting. And so those stocks will have to come up to meet those better expectations. And so I do think this is kind of a momentary blip. I don't think we're going to see like a 30 or 40% down market here. There's some people calling for that, but I just don't see how we get down there from the position we're in. So far, this is all just fear, and we're not seeing any signs of a recession or a slowdown. This is just everybody afraid of what's going to happen. Usually it doesn't pay to sell when people are afraid. Warren Buffett has said a lot of things over his lifetime, but one of the things that he said is, be fearful when others are greedy, and be greedy when others are fearful. And obviously, I don't agree with Mr. Buffett's politics. However, pretty hard to argue with his investing prowess. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that statement. Right now, we're a little bit in wait-and-see mode until earnings season, but we have quite a few things that we want to do. We just need to wait for the right timing.
Jake, we've been talking about earnings season and how it affects the market and what our listeners think about that. Do fundamentals, do you think, matter more than earnings season or the market in general?
fundamentals and earnings season kind of go hand in hand as far as we're seeing what the fundamentals of that company are actually producing. So I think what you're hinting at is the technicals versus the fundamentals. And I think technicals will tell you what the stock may do in the short term, but ultimately the fundamentals of that company, how much money they're producing, what their profit margins are like, what their revenue growth is, all those types of things are more indicative of the medium and long term. In the short term, you can see things in the charts that can kind of guide you when a good buying opportunity may come or when it's not a good time to sell or whatever. But ultimately, if companies make money, stocks go up. I mean, that's an oversimplification, but in general, that's pretty much how it works. If a company makes more money, then that company's stock price needs to go up to accommodate for the more money that they're making. That's the basic premise. I think if we're honest with ourselves and we look around and we say, okay, given the policies that this administration is putting into place, do we really think that companies are going to be worse off if the government spends less money and interferes with business less, puts people to work in the private sector and downsizes the government? Those are all expansionary things. Those are all things that help business, not hurt it. I think people are just a little bit freaked out about some of the world events going on right now. And I think as those start to get better, then that's another leg up for the market too. Again, at this point, it's all fear. So we need to wait for the data. It's always important to not just go off half-cocked and say, oh, stocks are low, I need to buy here. We don't know that they can't go lower, right? Or stocks are low and they're going to go lower, we need to sell. Well, we don't know that either. We need to move forward with prudence and discretion and go, all right, let's wait for the data to come in and then we can make our action. If we get ahead of it, we can find ourselves on the wrong side and wishing that we had not done that. So that's why we're just going to see what happens this next few weeks, and then we'll make some changes.
Talking with Jake Floyd of Floyd Financial Group, we're talking about earnings season, and of course that is coming up here in the very near future. And when all the data comes out, of course, we'll pass it on to you right here on Show Me the Money. Listening to the program today, you're wondering how earnings season will affect you. Maybe you've got questions about your stocks. Maybe you've got questions about anything that has to do with your journey towards a confident retirement. Give us a call here at Floyd Financial Group. We're local to you right here in Springfield, Missouri, 417-889-7233. We'd like to have a chance to sit down and talk to you on a one-on-one basis, just have a casual conversation so that you can ask your questions about your journey towards this confident retirement. There are no questions that are off limits. We can talk about pretty much anything, how to maximize Social Security, income planning, investments to support the income planning, healthcare, estate planning, legacy, you name it, we can talk about it. Again, it doesn't cost you a dime, 417-889-7233. There's no obligation, and certainly there is no judgment. We'll meet you where you are. So make that call today, 417-889-7233. You can also find out more about us online at floydfinancialgroup.com. Jake, time for a break. When we come back, we'll be talking about mistakes that people make with a 401k when our show continues here on 104.1 FM KSGF, where Springfield comes to talk.
Ready for another helping of some more real money talk? Thought so. Now, here's another serving of Show Me the Money with your hosts, Jake Floyd and Jeff Shea.
Welcome back to Show Me the Money. I'm Jake Floyd. In this segment, we're going to be talking about common mistakes that people make with their 401ks.
And Jake, the 401k seems like it should be the easiest part of retirement preparation. I mean, you put your money in there, you let it grow so that one day you could retire. How do people mess something like this up, Jake?
Yeah, so there's several things that can happen inside a 401k that are unintended. The first thing that comes to mind is there's a lot of money that goes into 401ks that gets stuck in what's called a retirement date fund or a life cycle fund. And the idea there is, let's say you're 30 and you're going to retire in 2055. So you buy a 2055 life cycle fund that basically, well, you're 30, it's going to be very aggressive. And as you get closer to retirement, it automatically changes with you as you get older so that it becomes more and more conservative until you get to the retirement age. So in theory, that sounds pretty good. There's a few key things underlying there. So number one, if you have like a TIA-CREF life cycle fund, what they have is it's a mutual fund, right? And so that mutual fund has expenses associated with it. And what they do in order to achieve the right blend is they sell you the mutual fund, and then inside that mutual fund are 7 or 8 other mutual funds that they're blending together, which you also pay fees on. So you're getting double dipped on most of those. There's a few exceptions. The Fidelity one doesn't charge a fee for the wrap. Vanguard is decently fair just because the fees are lower, but they do double dip you. But most of them are kind of a racket for the mutual fund companies. So fees in general are kind of a big deal in 401ks. Not all 401ks have high fees, but some do. And so understanding how much you're paying in fees is really a big deal, because if you're 25 or 30 years old and you got 30 years to work, if you pay 1% less in fees, you're going to have something like double the amount of money 30 years from now that you would have, simply because of the compounding on those fees. The money you otherwise would have paid in fees, it stays in your account. And so minimizing fees is really a big deal. That's something that we do here, but also even inside your retirement plan, understanding how much you're paying for different investments is a big deal.
And for those people who have 401ks, Jake, and I'm sure that a lot of people listening to us do have those, you have choices. I remember I had choices with my 401k. I would look down the list of the choices. I didn't understand any of the names, so I would just pick one. For example, there was one, it was something like a global high yield fund. Boy, that sounded like a good one. I brought that to a financial advisor. He said, you know what that is? That's foreign junk bonds. But It sounded good. I mean, you can't judge a book by its cover. How do you go about making a choice when you've got these choices and you don't know anything about them?
Yeah, that's kind of the tricky one, is the investing world is really rigged against the individual investor, meaning if you're not an investment expert, they do their very best to make things opaque so that you cannot see through to understand the fees, understand the investments. So let's say I have a Vanguard fund, or I go to Vanguard with money and I say, hey, I want you to invest this money. I'm a 50-50 risk tolerance. They're going to say, okay, great. They take that money and they will put 40% of that money in international funds, both bonds and stocks. That's not intuitive, right? If I go to an investment company, I don't expect them to put anything international unless I ask them to. And I think there's a lot of people listening to this show that would be shocked to find out that any portion of their international is like 40% in China. So if you have 40% of your money in international and 40% of that's in China, that means 16% of your total portfolio is in China, which is crazy. China is a communist state. They can just take your stuff and nationalize it anytime they want. They can make companies and CEOs disappear overnight. Why would we want to invest in something like that? And the answer is we wouldn't, and we probably wouldn't unless we didn't know. And these companies are a little bit on a power trip where they're like, hey, the investor doesn't need to know. We know what's best. And I kind of reject that notion. If you've listened to this show for very long, you realize that I reject that notion. I think people can understand if somebody's willing to take the time to explain it to them. And I think that keeping things more domestic, if you look at any time horizon longer than about 2 years, if you compare other countries, other regions' stock markets to ours, you'll notice that our stock market just decimates everybody. In a given year, it's possible for emerging markets or international stocks to outperform, but over a 2 or 3 year period up to like a 50-year period, the United States just stomps everything. Back to your question about how to understand what you're investing in. If you're really young, you really want to look for a large cap stock fund. You want to try to tie that money toward the S&P 500. You have a long time horizon. Again, this is general. This is not like specific advice, but you want to really allow yourself to make some money. You don't want to be too conservative early on. As you get closer to retirement, that's really what financial advisors are for. Even if we can't move that money out of there and change things for you, because if you're still working and you're under 59 and a half, you can't move that money. I still talk to lots of 50 and 55-year-olds that come in and say, hey, what do you think about what I'm doing here? What tweaks could we make to maybe either enhance returns or protect money if we're getting really close to retirement or whatever? Those are conversations that I'm definitely willing to have with people as they're approaching retirement. But really, without going and doing a lot of research, you don't know. And that's by design. And I think that's wrong.
Talking with Jake Floyd, Floyd Financial Group, we're talking about mistakes that people make with their 401ks. If you feel that you have made some mistakes or you want to prevent making mistakes in the future, give us a call here. We'd love to talk to you about your 401k. Take a look at it and see where you stand. 417-889-7233 is our telephone number. You can make that call this weekend, leave your name, telephone number, and Ashley will call you back during the week and set up a brief conversation with you and Jake to talk about your 401ks. No cost, no obligation, certainly no judgment. 417-889-7233. So we have talked about mistakes that involve not knowing your fees, some of the investment options, not defaulting to target date funds. Another mistake that I would think that people make, Jake, is maximizing contributions. What is the max contribution in 2025?
So, Jeff, in 2025, the max normal contribution is $23,500. If you are between 50 and 60, you have a $7,500 additional catch-up contribution. And if you are over 60 to 63, if your plan allows it, you can have additional catch-up up to $11,250. So you can contribute quite a bit of money. For the average person, that's more than enough to be able to contribute. There are some people that want to contribute more than that. There are ways to do that if you want to do it on a pre-tax basis. If you're making $100,000 or something like that, you're still going to be able to contribute nearly 40% of your income if you wanted to, if you're nearing retirement. That's a pretty big number. So a lot of people are only aware of IRA contribution limits, which if you're over 50 is $8,000. So you can do quite a lot more inside a qualified retirement plan like a 401k.
Jake, if you've had a 401k for a long period of time at your job, I know that you made these investment choices early on. As you get older, should these investment choices change to less riskier investments?
Generally speaking, the answer to that is yes, but it really varies a lot person to person. You know, how much does your spouse make? Are you married? What's the time horizon on them and their work and their retirement? How much money are they going to have? How much money are you going to have? There's a lot of considerations to that. But generally speaking, when we get in the retirement red zone, we should be looking at it inside of 5 years and kind of assess the current environment and what the likelihood of recession and that kind of thing is and kind of look around. Certainly when we get within 2 years, we really want to start to think about dialing back the risk because we don't want to be at the mercy of a bad market at the time. So yeah, these are all good conversations to have. I wouldn't say there's like a blanket solution for that, but definitely inside of 5 years, it's probably good to be talking to someone if you're thinking about retiring to kind of get ahead of the 8 ball and understand how much income you can expect in retirement, talk about Social Security, all that kind of thing. Sooner is better than later.
Tax diversification, Jake, 401ks versus the Roth 401k. What mistakes do people make there?
Sometimes we see a lot of people that are not making a lot of money contributing to normal 401ks where they're saving a little bit of taxes now, but it may be costing them taxes later. But the one I see more often is very high income people contributing to Roth. And so that's costing them, if you're making a couple $100,000 a year, it's going to cost you 22% for the Fed and 5% for the state. And so it probably makes more sense to do pre-tax in that scenario, knowing that in retirement, your tax bracket is likely to be less. So just understanding what you're doing when you fund a Roth versus funding a traditional 401k, for example, understanding what that does to you tax-wise and whether it's appropriate to use a Roth. But that's probably the biggest one is I see people really putting money in a Roth. Sometimes even in like the max tax bracket, they're still putting money in the Roth, which in my opinion doesn't make a lot of sense. You should take that tax deduction and allow yourself to save more money rather than paying all the taxes now and hoping that you're in a higher tax bracket later so that you didn't have the Roth for nothing. So I think that's a big one. And so just understanding where those lines are when you should be looking at traditional versus Roth is probably a good idea.
Jake, what is the mistake that people can make after retiring with their 401k?
So after you retire, a lot of the benefits that you get from a 401k cease to exist. So your ability to take tax advantage loans and pay yourself back the interest goes away once you're retired. Once you sever employment, pretty much all the benefits of that 401k kind of go away. And all you're left with is the restrictions in the investing. So inside a 401k, when it gets set up, there's certain investment options that get set up. And that's what you're limited to invest in most 401ks. If you leave the money there, you might have a handful of mutual funds that you can invest in. Versus if you roll that money out to an IRA, then the world is kind of your oyster and you can invest that money in a lot of different ways if you want to. Another mistake, I don't see this very often because I think a lot of people are aware that it's a problem, but if you retire and you take all that money out and you stick it in your checking account figuring out what to do next, you're about to owe a lot of taxes. So you want to make sure that when you move that money out of there, you're doing some kind of rollover or whatever so that you're deferring those taxes until you take the money out so you don't have a big tax hickey, as my dad would say if he was sitting here. We don't want to have a big tax problem. So if you roll that money over to an IRA, then you're going to defer those taxes. And so that's another big deal.
Talking with Jake Floyd, Floyd Financial Group, we're talking about common mistakes that people make with their 401k. I'm sure listening to the program today, you may have a 401k, and certainly you may have some questions about mistakes that you might be making with it. Or maybe you're retiring now, you don't know what to do with your 401k. If that's you, give us a call here at Floyd Financial Group at 417-889-7233. We'd love to sit down with you, have a casual conversation about how to avoid these mistakes with your 401k. Again, no questions off limits. We'd love to talk to you not only about that, but anything that relates to your journey towards a confident retirement. We're offering an opportunity for you to sit down with Jake, Randy, or anybody else in the office right now that applies to your conversation at 417-889-7233. No cost, no obligation, certainly no judgment. We'll meet you where you are. Make that call this weekend, 417-889-7233. You can also find out more about us online at floydfinancialgroup.com. Jake, let's take a break. When we come back here on Show Me the Money, we'll be talking about the realities of spousal risk and retirement. Our show continues here on 104.1 FM KSGF, where Springfield comes to talk.
Ready to climb a mountain of financial know-how? Good, because it's time for more Show Me the Money with your financial Sherpa, Jake Floyd.
Welcome back to Show Me the Money. I'm Jake Floyd, and in this segment, we're going to talk about something that's a little less fun, but very important, and that's spousal risk, or the death of a spouse potentially in retirement.
That's right, Jake. We talk about all the fun things on this show. Certainly we do talk about some fun things, but death and taxes, they're so important, and I think if you address these now, they're not going to be so impactful when that time does come. So, Jake, how can the loss of a spouse affect a retirement plan?
Yeah, I think the most effect that you can feel on this is just what happens to the spouse's income, the remaining spouse's income, and understanding how Social Security looks at this, but also a potential pension if you have a pension, how many dollars we have in assets that can produce income and that kind of thing, because there's a lot of situations where maybe the man in the house has a sizable pension. Maybe he worked at a railroad or was a police officer or worked for city utilities or whatever. And if you have that pension and all of a sudden that pension goes away, that can leave your spouse with quite a hole there, because you're also going to lose the smaller of the two Social Securities, assuming you've already filed for Social Security. You get to keep the bigger of the two. But even on the front end, when we're electing our pensions, we need to consider what happens if something happens early to the person that's the pensioner. And so understanding what can happen income-wise, because sometimes there's situations where maybe you're used to $7,000 or $8,000 a month, and when your spouse dies, you lose $6,000 of that, and you're left with $2,000 a month. So obviously that's going to leave a big hole in your budget, and so we need to figure out what the best way to protect against that is. Do we need some temporary life insurance on that person to kind of bridge that gap if the pension doesn't allow for a survivor's benefit or that kind of thing? Or if we've just already elected it, there's things we can do to kind of help guard against that if we're paying attention and we understand what the risk is.
And another thing that people do not consider sometimes, Jake, is tax adjustments. The standard deduction for people filing jointly here in 2025 is $30,000, but if you go from 2 to 1, it's going to be considerably less, isn't it?
Yeah, I tell people when they come in my office, the government hates single people, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is, but from a tax perspective, you're at a pretty massive disadvantage being single versus having a joint household. Like you said, if you lose a spouse and you don't lose income, let's say that that spouse was the lesser earner and your income really isn't that affected. Now, all of a sudden, you're paying a whole bunch more in taxes because you have the same income, but much less deduction, probably a higher tax bracket, depending on how much income you have. So, yeah, these are all factors that we need to consider. And the last thing most of the people listening to the show want to have happen is something happen to them and then leave their spouses in a worse situation.
And we're not trying to be all doom and gloom here this morning in the radio program about the loss of a spouse. We're just trying to talk about some of the things that could happen when you lose a spouse, and then we'll tell you how to maybe circumvent some of these things with proper planning. Next one is going to be increased health care costs. Often that is a byproduct of losing a spouse. When you have an emotional event, it can have an effect on you physically.
Absolutely, Jeff. Healthcare costs, you're going to pay I think the number is 85% of your healthcare costs after you turn 65. And so there's a lot of things that will come up later in life, inevitably, that are related to healthcare. When you lose a spouse or when you're about to lose a spouse, sometimes that can rack up some bills too, especially depending on your age and whether you're on a supplement or Advantage plan and that kind of thing. So again, understanding where that money is going to come from when you most likely have these healthcare costs come in is part of what we'll talk about when we develop a plan. Is, let's say if one of the spouses has to go to the nursing home, what are we going to do? How are we going to not be impoverished by that? How are we going to deal with that situation? Some people have saved a lot of money and it's not really a big issue. Some people really need all that money that they've saved and they need to not be impoverished by a $300,000 or $400,000 nursing home bill so that they can live once the other spouse is gone. And so if you have a situation, by the way, right now where you have a spouse in the nursing home or are faced with that situation, there are things that can be done to salvage that money so that it doesn't have to be all spent on the nursing home. So if that's you, you can call us. We have a full-time person dedicated to that type of planning. So again, just know that there are things that can be done, especially if it's a husband and wife. If it's your mother or something like that and she's in the nursing home, there's still things that we can do to help save some assets in most situations from nursing home costs. So just kind of throw that out there just because a lot of people don't know that there's things that can be done. And sometimes they spend their money down just because nobody told them they didn't have to. And so if that's you, do give us a ring. As far as healthcare costs, they can be very devastating. I've seen people spend their entire life savings and then come to me and say, well, what do I do now? I'll be like, well, unfortunately, after you spend the money, there's not a lot we can do. So if you want to talk about, you can come see us.
That's right. And Randy certainly does have a great strategy. And you too, Jake, here at Floyd Financial Group, we can help you save the family farm from the nursing home. That telephone number, 417-889-7233. Make that call this weekend. Leave your name, telephone number. Ashley will give you a call back during the week. Set you up with a brief conversation with Jake. You can talk for 20, 30 minutes or as long as you need to talk about the things we're talking about on the radio today. And this is the loss of a spouse in retirement. Next one has to do with housing and living expenses. You know, when two people become one, housing becomes an issue, or it can become an issue, Jake. What are some of the things that we need to know about?
Yeah, especially if your house is not paid off. Obviously, you still have a house payment. I think there's a lot of people when this happens, though, that already have their house paid off. So I think that part is a little bit less of an issue. When we have a spouse pass away, it's really, what are our spending habits? How much is that going to change? Obviously, you don't need food for two anymore, that kind of thing. So it's really more a function of the spouse that passed away. How much income did they lose versus how much income are we keeping? And what can we do to generate some more income to help kind of ease that burden of not only losing the spouse so you can grieve and not have to worry about money, but also just to make sure you can make ends meet each month. As far as housing, yeah, I think trying to have that house paid off before you retire is a good idea, but in the event that you don't have it paid off before you retire, there are some things we can do there. Depending on how dire the situation is, we could consider doing a reverse mortgage where that would pay off that house so that you don't have to make any more payments. Again, there's pros and cons to that. That's something we can get into. That's kind of a nitty-gritty subject. I'm not saying everybody needs a reverse mortgage for sure, but in the right situation, it can be a lifesaver.
And the survivor may need to downsize a little bit. Dad has many times mowed the 2 or 4 acres out there, can't do it anymore. 3,000 square foot house. There's one of you might want to downsize to 1,500 square feet. So that is something to consider.
Sure.
Housing and living expenses many times need to be changed. Finally, it's estate and inheritance issues. What happens when one spouse dies?
Yeah, so especially if you have like a blended family where you have a previous marriage and you have kids and they have kids, there can be quite a mess there. If it's a single first marriage, only marriage, it's a little bit less complicated, but there are some gotchas out there. If you don't have estate planning documents like trusts and powers of attorney and all that kind of thing, and everything's not spelled out and titled and have TODs and PODs properly, there can be some things that happen where inadvertently money goes where you didn't expect it to go. So having all that ironed out on the front end is usually the best guard against that, especially, again, like I said, if you have a blended family. There's a lot of considerations where there's her money and his money and our money, and then you don't want your kids to get disinherited because the money goes to the spouse. A lot of times that happens where then when the spouse dies, it just goes to their kids instead of to all the kids. So really planning all that out in advance is very important if you want it to go the way that you see in your mind's eye.
So those are some of the downsides to losing a spouse. Let's talk about how we can maybe make this a little more tolerable. We talked about income in the beginning. Can maximizing Social Security benefits really make that much of a difference?
Yeah, so depending on the situation, and this is fairly rare, Jeff, in my opinion, but there are some situations. I can think of a client that I have right now that's specifically delaying his Social Security so that it's almost like a death benefit for his wife. He doesn't need the income right now. He's working into his 70s, and instead of taking Social Security earlier, like at full retirement age and investing it, which is arguably a better decision, specifically to protect his wife, he decided to delay it so that if all the money's gone at some point, she still gets the Social Security. I do think that can make sense in a few situations. But again, more important is if you have one spouse that's getting $3,000 a month Social Security, one that's getting $1,000 a month Social Security, you just need to realize that if one of those spouses passes away, you get to keep the $3,000 and then you're going to lose the $1,000. Now, sometimes it's more evenly distributed where they're both getting $2,000. So that means you're going to lose $2,000 when one of them's gone. And so having a plan to account for that loss of income ahead of time is the best way to handle it instead of trying to clean up the spilled milk after it happens.
And if you've already taken Social Security, you're not sure that you did it the right way and it's less than a year, there is the opportunity for a do-over. But if you're not sure about what to do, give us a call here at Floyd Financial Group. We'll run that Social Security optimization program for you if you haven't taken Social Security yet. 417-889-7233 is our telephone number. Obtaining adequate life insurance before you need it is probably a pretty big one. So, Jake, how do we figure out how much life insurance and what type of life insurance we should have?
That's a good question, Jeff. There's a lot of factors that would go into that. I would just say that generally speaking, if we're concerned about one spouse over the other's income, meaning the income's really lopsided, let's say the man has $2,000 and the lady in the family has $6,000 in income. Buying life insurance on her makes sense to protect him, but we probably don't want to buy insurance the other way because then we're kind of just wasting the money from that standpoint, at least. We also don't necessarily want to buy permanent insurance because it's much more expensive. So you probably want to buy a term policy, again, depending on age, 10, 15, 20 years, where a term policy, you can just kind of stop paying it anytime you're ready, but you can buy that protection up to a certain point. Sometimes we'll buy two policies. We'll buy one that's bigger, that's shorter. So we'll buy a big policy for 10 years and a small policy for 20 years. And then that kind of has a grading effect over the next 20 years. Then you have more protection now, less protection later, which is what you really need as time goes forward. If you're 80, you probably don't need 30 years of income protection, right?
Right.
But if you're 60, you probably do. These are all factors that we can talk about when you come in. Again, it's hard to account for every single situation out there right now, especially if you're looking at electing a pension at some point. You're about to retire and turn on your pension, and you're trying to figure out whether you should get survivor's benefit or not. Let's talk about that, because a lot of times what makes sense is we take the full pension amount because they gut you if you try to do a survivor benefit. They'll take a huge amount. Some pensions take more, some pensions take less, so we have to evaluate each one. But let's say you're going to get a $3,000 a month pension, and if you do a 50% survivor benefit, you're going to get $2,000. It's better in a lot of cases, if you qualify health-wise and all that kind of thing, to take the $3,000 and then buy life insurance for a couple $100 a month that satisfies the difference than it is just to take the $2,000, right? Because you're still getting $800 a month more income, even after you pay for the insurance. Strategies like that are things that we should consider, especially when it comes to pensions, to make sure that other spouse is protected.
So the point of our conversation this morning is to get you thinking about what happens when one spouse passes away. How will the surviving spouse go on? And if you'd like some help with that problem, give us a call here at Floyd Financial Group. We would love to set you up with a plan that will account for the surviving spouse to make their life a little bit easier. 417-889-7233 is our number. You can make that call right now to request your no-cost, no-obligation Floyd Financial Group retirement review, which will talk about the death of a spouse, among other things. Again, no cost, no obligation, no judgment. 417-889-7233. Make that call today. You can also find out more about us online at floydfinancialgroup.com. Jake, let's take a break. When we come back here on Show Me the Money, we're going to be talking about 5 retirement planning myths that could hold you back when our show continues here on 104.1 FM KSGF, where Springfield comes to talk.
People of the Ozarks, step away from the fishing pole and prepare to be shown the money. because we're back with more straight talk and honest answers with Jake Floyd and Jeff Shea.
Welcome back to Show Me the Money. I'm Jake Floyd. In this last segment, we're going to be talking about retirement myths that might trip you up.
That's right. People want simple, but simple many times hurts people, Jake, and they make mistakes. Myth number one, and I have seen this everywhere, is, boy, if I don't have $1 million in order to retire, I'm just not going to make it. Now, that's not necessarily true, is it? Especially here in the last basket of sanity.
It's definitely not true. There are people that $1 million won't even get them started. And I talk to those people a couple times a week, but I think the vast majority of people in this area are not used to making $200,000 a year in retirement or something like that. So we don't need these astronomical numbers. I'd say the average person that comes to see me probably has between $400,000 to $600,000 or so saved for retirement. They're making kind of a modest wage, and what we need to do is use Social Security and their investments to kind of bridge the gap between what they're making now and what they need to be making in retirement. Some people have pensions, some people don't. Most don't. I think it's like less than 13% of people now have a pension, so don't feel left out if you don't. But you definitely don't necessarily need $1 million. Again, it really comes down to what you want to do in retirement, how much you want to spend in retirement, what's important to you, how important it is to leave money to beneficiaries, that kind of thing. It's not really this magical too common number.
Right, but if you just want to fish off the bank, maybe you want to watch the cows graze in the back 40, you want to visit the children, the grandchildren once in a while, and you've got $300,000 or $250,000 in retirement, Jake, your house is paid off, you're living here in the last bastion of sanity, you've got Social Security, you're not going to starve in retirement, are you?
I have quite a few people that live on their Social Security and save all their money.
Yeah.
And they're just planning to pass it to their kids, and they don't need any of it. The average person doesn't do that, but I have a lot of people that do that. I have a lot of people that are spending more than they should be, frankly, too. There's all kinds of ways to do retirement. I have people that front load their income where they say, hey, this next 10 years, I want to spend half my retirement assets, knowing that after that, my health may not hold up and I won't be able to do what I want to do. Right. And that's okay that I'll have less later. And so there's a lot of ways to do it, and nobody's going to do it quite like you're going to do it. But you certainly don't necessarily need $1 million. There's people that retire on nothing, basically, and they just, again, live on Social Security and that kind of thing. But that's something that we can talk at length about when you come see us, and we'll help you kind of understand what's necessary. I would say the average person, a good rule of thumb, and again, this is not specific investment advice over the radio here, but a good rule of thumb is if you have 75 or 80% of your income in retirement, of your gross income of what you had while you were working, that's usually a good rule of thumb, because you're not going to be funding your retirement plan. You don't pay Social Security tax, workers' comp, FICA, all that kind of thing goes away. So usually it takes somewhere between 75 and 80% of your gross income normally to make it feel about like it does now. And to your point, Jeff, I think a good analogy is when you want to go fishing in retirement, do you want to do that with a $100,000 bass boat and a $100,000 truck pulling it around, or do you want to fish off the bank?
Yeah.
And that's kind of a great example of how people do things differently in retirement, where some people don't need a big fancy, they need a $30 Bass Pro rod, little bucket of worms, and they're good. Some people want to go ocean fishing and spend $40,000 on a vacation. So understanding where you're at and what you want is the first step that we take. And then after that, we can figure out about how to get you there. But we have to understand where you want to go first.
Yeah, and those fishing rods can get to be quite expensive. I was walking in my supermarket the other day, and do you know, right inside the front door, they had those Zebco rods and reels like we used to have when we were kids. They were like $20 or so. And I thought, man, I'm going to pick me up one of those things and just keep it in the car and be ready. But you're right. If you want a $100,000 bass boat, if you're looking to buy a $100,000 Cadillac Escalade or Lincoln Navigator, yeah, you can't make it if you don't have a bunch of money. But if you're driving a 10-year-old used car, it's just fine with you. And as you said, you have simple wants and needs. You don't need $1 million. And that's what I mean by we'll meet you where you are here at Floyd Financial Group. You do not have to have $1 million to talk to us. We'd love to talk to you. 417-889-7233 is our telephone number. We're talking about common myths in retirement. The next one is you should never touch your principal in retirement. What do you think about that one, Jake?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely a myth. Most people will touch their principal in retirement. Usually also retirement plans don't come with a perfect fixed 5 or 6% income stream for 30 years and never have any risk or have any fluctuation in balance and that kind of thing. For the most part, people are going to have some money in the market and we're going to have some money that's safe, but that money in the market's going to fluctuate. But over the long haul, what we want to do is set up a reasonable expectation as far as how much money you're going to take out, and then kind of couple that with the investments that make sense to try to stabilize things as much as possible. Again, I have people that are like, hey, my kids are fine. They don't need my money. I want to live on my money. I have people that come in and say, hey, Jake, I want my last check to bounce. I want to have nothing left at the end. And I have people that say, hey, I'm going to go shop at Goodwill so I can leave my kids $1 million and everything in between. So again, this is where it comes down to understanding you and your goals. But touching your principal is not necessarily a bad thing, but we certainly don't want to see it nosedive. And so we'll talk about how to mitigate risk and how to make sure that we can reasonably expect your money to last as long as you do.
Next myth I want to talk about, Jake, is about taxes. The zero tax bracket is the best tax bracket. Is that a myth?
I would say that's a huge myth because I don't want to make less than $10,000 net a year. And so in order to get to the zero bracket, you got to not make a whole lot of money. So I would rather make $1 million and be in the 39% tax bracket because I still have more money left over. So I despise taxes, don't get me wrong, and I think taxation is theft as far as I'm concerned, but paying some taxes means you made money, and It's not the end of the world to pay some taxes. I know I probably have a few listeners here that we realized some gains last year that had to pay some taxes, and you're probably gritting your teeth right now a little bit, but at the same time, that means we made money, and so if I ever have to make a choice between losing the money and just paying the taxes and keeping the money, I'm going to choose the latter. I don't want to be in the 0% tax bracket. I don't want any of my people to be in the 0% tax bracket because I want them to be able to live better than that.
Well, if you made $30,000 a year, let's say, in a part-time job, your standard deduction's $30,000, so you would pay no taxes then. But I'm with you. I mean, I would rather make some money and pay the taxes than not make any money. But yeah, taxes is a big bone of contention for a lot of folks, and it is a large part of the conversations that we have here at Floyd Financial Group are legal ways to minimize those taxes. Talking with Jake Floyd at Floyd Financial Group, we're talking about the 5 retirement myths on today's radio program. Next one is I should file for Social Security at 2 ages. It's either 62 or 70. Let's talk about that a little bit, Jake.
Yeah, so there's a lot of generalizations that get made in Social Security planning where people are like, you should turn it on as soon as you can because it's going to go away and you're never going to get any money if you don't turn it on now. That's not true. Or I should wait until 70 to maximize it because it's always better to wait as long as humanly possible, which is also not true. What I would say is not every decision is a financial decision either, right? Because if we're going to do the very best thing always financially, you would never retire. You work till you're 90 and you wake up dead one day because that's better for you financially, right? But we also have to be practical. And the reason you want to make good financial decisions is so that you can retire and you can enjoy retirement. So we have to weigh all these things out. I would say generally speaking, though, we don't want to turn on Social Security if you're still working full-time. Because if you're before full retirement age, you could only make $23,900 a year before you have to start paying back Social Security. And we don't ever really want to be in a situation where we're paying it back. However, once you retire and you're going to stay retired, it generally makes sense to turn on Social Security to maximize your money that you have saved instead of spending it down trying to maximize Social Security. I'd rather spend Social Security to maximize what you have. That way it puts all the control in your control instead of in Social Security's control and whether they cut it or not or means test it or not. So once you're actually retired, it generally makes sense to turn it on. Or if you turn 67, depending on the rest of your income, it may make sense to turn it on and even invest that money if you are not needing it right away, or if you want to drop to part-time or something like that, you can turn it on. Again, there's a lot of things to consider, so I don't want to make it seem simple. And this is probably the number one thing I spend time on in the office here is when should we file for Social Security? When does it make sense to retire? Those types of questions are something we spend a lot of time on, and I'm happy to spend time with you guys too.
And you can take it at any time between 62 and 70. You can take it at 63, 64, 65. But as you said, for most people, full retirement age is going to be 67. So that is something that we'd be happy to talk to you about here at Floyd Financial Group. 417-889-7233 is our telephone number. Final myth I want to talk about today is I have a totally riskless retirement plan. To my knowledge, Jake, every investment has some sort of risk to it, or does it not?
Absolutely. There's really no such thing as riskless. Let's say you just have nothing but CDs, then you have interest rate risk, right? Meaning if you have nothing but CDs, I don't have to tell you about that because you spent 13 years at 0% interest where your CDs were paying less than 1%. So it may feel great right now when you're getting 4 to 5%, but as you know, interest rates can drop. If you have money in the market, obviously that's the risk most people are thinking about, but there's all types of different risk. And so you're never going to have a riskless retirement plan. You can certainly have ones that are more risky than others. Understanding what can come out and bite you in retirement is kind of my job to tell you about. I've helped thousands of people at this point in their retirement in one way or another. Hopefully, you're only going to do it once, right? And so it makes sense to lean on my experience and Randy's experience to help guide you through this process. And we can say, hey, what if we did this? And I can rely on my experiences and go, oh, no, we did that in one situation. This is what happened, right? So allow my experience to help you make good decisions when it comes to risk, when it comes to interest rate risk, and when it comes to just how to navigate this thing overall.
We've been debunking 5 retirement myths with Jake Floyd here, Floyd Financial Group, here on Show Me the Money. If you believed any of these myths and you want some help with your retirement plan, we'd love to talk to you. As we say every week, no cost, no obligation, no judgment. You don't have to have $1 million to talk to us. We'll meet you where you are. Call 417-889-7233. Talk to Ashley, and she'll set up a conversation so that you can sit down with Jake, Randy here at Floyd Financial Group and talk about your journey towards a more confident retirement. Again, it's not going to cost you anything, no judgment and no obligation. 417-889-7233. Also, go out to the website. Check us out online at floydfinancialgroup.com. Jake's been a great program today. If our listeners have missed any part of it, remember we're a podcast. Go to wherever you get your podcast, search for Show Me the Money with Randy and Jake Floyd and myself. You'll find this show and a lot of our past shows, so you can stay up on your favorite radio program. Out of time for this week, Jake. Thank you so much for your time. And for everybody listening to us, I want you to go out and have yourself a great weekend. We'll talk to you again next week right here with another edition of Show Me the Money on 104.1 FM KSGF, where Springfield comes to talk. The information provided in the preceding program is for educational purposes only and is not intended as investment advice for any individual or entity. All information contained herein is believed to be from reliable sources. However, we make no representations as to its completeness or accuracy. The opinions expressed are subject to change without notice and do not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice. Please consult your financial professional before executing any financial strategy. Financial planning is offered through Floyd Financial Group, LLC, and